Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third and last session of our symposium dedicated to the memory of Jim Powell. My name is Mathieu van der Meer. I am teaching Latin here at Syracuse University. I consider myself, though, mainly as a medievalist, and it is in that nature, in that character, that I am particularly honored and feel privileged to introduce to you our next speaker, Professor Giles Constable, one of the leading experts in medieval history. Professor Constable taught in Princeton, New Jersey until 2003 and is since then a member of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. He published no less than 25 books and more than 100 scholarly articles. Among his main achievements, there are many main achievements of Professor Constable, but some stand out, particularly which are, for instance, the letters. The edition of the letters of Peter the Venerable and high and late medieval monastic consuetudines. The three best-known books, monographs of Professor Constable himself are Monastic Tithes from Their Origins to the 12th Century, which came out, we just discussed it in the 50s, so quite a while ago. Still, it's a very important book. Then 3 studies in medieval religious and social thought, published in Cambridge in 1995, and The Reformation of the 12th Century, probably his best book, or best known book, at least that's the one that comes to my mind immediately, which came out in Cambridge as well in 1996. Professor Constable will today give a lecture here called Letter Collections in the Middle Ages. The word is to Professor Constable.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. Can you hear me for those kind words? And let me say first, what a pleasure it is to be here to join in the tribute to Jim Powell. In addition to what's already been said, I'd like to just say a word about his work in promoting medieval studies at Syracuse, of which this meeting is itself a witness as to how many medievalists there are here and what a lively interest there is in the Middle Ages, and also his breadth of interest. This I have to stress because my paper this afternoon is not exactly within the field that he particularly worked on, but I like to think that he would have been interested in it and would join in adding his knowledge of medieval letters, even though he didn't write on them, to what I am going to say. Now, letters are among the most important sources for his study of medieval history, but they're also among the most problematical. Before using a letter, an historian must ask many questions. Who wrote it? When? And why? Is it a real letter, in the sense that it was delivered to the addressee, or is it a fictional letter? Was it subsequently revised? And how was it preserved? Aside from prefatory letters and a few isolated copies of letters found in chronicles and saints' lives, almost all medieval letters, at least 99% I had to guess, are preserved in collections. Very few originals survive, and letters that were not incorporated into collections have, for the most part, disappeared. In spite of their importance, however, letter collections as such have received comparatively little attention from scholars. The terminology for letters and letter collections is confused and ambiguous. In the Middle Ages, a letter was referred to as a littera, an epistola, carta, apex, brevis, and other terms. The modern scholarly distinction between letters and charters, and between public and private letters, in the legal sense, were unknown in the Middle Ages, when all letters were to some extent public. A collection of letters was called a collectio, registrum, corpus, cartularium, or an epistolarium, which is now commonly used primarily for the humanist letter collections of the 14th and 15th centuries. Modern terms for collections of letters of various types include archive, cartulary, register, copybook, letterbook, and act book. But the distinction between these various types of collections is unclear. In my book on medieval letters, published now 35 years ago, I divided letter collections into literary or planned, didactic, exemplary or model, and archival or casual collections. But I am inclined now to agree with Walter Iserbert that it's impossible to classify collections on the basis of the letters they include. In an age of intellectual ferment, according to Bruce Brasington, no form was more immediate and flexible than the letter collection. There is a significant overlap between the various types of collections. Most literary collections include letters of which the purpose was practical, and they were frequently used as sources for model letters. Cartularies served historical and personal, as well as archival purposes, and recorded the histories of institutions and the achievements of individuals. Didactic collections of model letters, including real as well as exemplary letters. Should a letter written by an author, or in his or her name, but never sent, be considered real? Many letters were written in the names of others, ex persona, or ghostwritten, as we would say, and some of the most eminent of medieval letter writers wrote letters for other people, sometimes on the basis of their notes or instructions. Then there are fictional letters which were never intended to be sent, and others that are outright forgeries and designed to deceive. Whole collections of letters, like those of St. Nilus and of Seneca and St. Paul, were forged in late antiquity. Some of the letters of Jerome and Augustine are suspect, and many fictitious letters were composed in the Middle Ages, including letters from heaven and from Christ and the devil. During the Renaissance, letters were sometimes created by adding a salutation and conclusion to a literary excerpt, like the alleged letter from the Emperor Augustus to Horace. Petrarch wrote factitious letters, including the account of his ascent of Mont Ventoux, and the earliest literary novel dates from the 15th century. Such letters constitute a separate subfield of pseudepigraphy. Letters of all types were written and collected by both men and women throughout the Middle Ages. Eloise, Hildegard of Bingen, and Catherine of Siena are among the most famous of medieval letter writers. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the collections of Symmachus, Augustine, Gregory the Great, and above all St. Paul were widely known, as were the letters of many classical writers. Letter collections continued to be made in the Merovingian and Carolingian periods. Some of the best-known collections date from the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, including those of Anselm of Canterbury, Bernard of Clairvaux, Peter the Venerable of Cluny, and Peter of Blois, whose collection survives in over 200 manuscripts and can legitimately be called a medieval bestseller. The later 12th and 13th centuries were marked by works of professional letter writers, or dictatores, who wrote treatises on the art of letter writing, known as dictamen, which were often accompanied by collections of model letters. Fewer literary collections were made at this time, but new life was breathed into the art of letter writing in the 14th and 15th centuries by the discovery and imitation of the works of some of the great classical letter writers, especially Cicero and Pliny. It is not my intention today, however, to survey the history of writing and collecting of letters in the Middle Ages, nor the questions of how letters were written and delivered, which I have studied elsewhere. I want rather to consider how and why letters were preserved and collected. These are questions to which there are no easy answers, and in the course of my paper I shall raise more questions than I can answer. In my conclusion I shall make some general remarks, perhaps I should say warnings, about the use of letter collections, which are often less straightforward than they may appear at first sight. The problems begin with nomenclature. Medieval letter collections are for the most part named for the author who wrote the letters or in whose name they were written. Bernhard Schmeidler in particular emphasized the unity of style and chronological order of collections of letters written by a single author or by his or her secretary and entered as they were written into a register or letter book. Other scholars, including Karl Erdmann, stressed the importance of recipients in the formation of letter collections. Some collections include more letters to than from the writer for whom the collection is named. Several important letter collections, including those of St. Victor and the Literae Cantuariensis, are named for the place from which they emanated or with which they are associated. Others may be called subject collections and consist of letters dealing with a particular subject, such as the Libelle d'Elite, dealing with the investiture controversy, many of which are in letter form, and the Becket letters, of which very few were written by Thomas Becket himself. An early 11th century mathematical correspondence has been described as an epistolary tournament between two writers who clearly expected their letters to circulate, perhaps even before they were sent. Scholars have long debated the ways in which the letters were preserved and the respective roles of authors and secretaries, of recipients, and of later copyists and admirers. A few writers made their own collections, either by keeping copies of their letters or by recovering them from the recipients. Very rarely the original manuscript has survived, as of the collected letters and poems of Guy of Bazoches, with corrections by the author, but whether he collected them himself is uncertain. Desiderius of Cahors, Lupus of Ferrières, Alcuin, Peter Damiani, Ivo of Chartres, and Hildebert of Le Mans kept copies of their own letters. Gerhard of Reichersberg, according to the priest Magnus, kept almost all the letters, which Magnus said he wrote at different times to different people, in a register or epistolary book in 2 volumes, which are now unfortunately lost. Writers who failed to keep copies of their letters might recover them from the recipients. Arnulf of Lisieux wrote to Giles of La Perche that I have gathered into a little book, Libellum, the letters which I sent at some time to various people and which you ask to see. I have gathered those I could with the greatest care, because no copies, exemplaria, of them stayed with me, but I have received them as if improved, velud emendicatus, from those by whom they were by chance preserved. The older and better letters, he went on to say, were lost. Now this passage may be to some extent a literary conceit, but it shows that Arnulf expected the recipients of his letters not only to keep them, but also to revise them. It was a well-established practice to ask a recipient to keep and to return a letter. Peter Damiani asked the abbot of Pomposa that this little letter, Breviculus, may not perish, but may be copied into some book, in order that the memory of my devotion to you may be preserved. Peter also kept, and occasionally cited, copies of his own letters. Peter Essel asked the abbot of St. Cyprian to save these letters for us, and similar requests were made by Anselm, Bernard of Clairvaux, Arnulf of Lisieux, Peter the Venerable, Catherine of Siena, and other medieval letter writers. Peter the Venerable told his secretary Peter of Poitiers to send him our letters. Oswald of Clare wanted to have a letter returned if the recipient did not grant his request, but not otherwise. And Peter of Blois asked Peter Roussillon to return the letters, which I entrusted, commodavi, to your friendship for the correction of the letters. It is uncertain in these cases whether the recipients kept and returned the original letter or copy. A few collections included, or perhaps were even based entirely on originals, some of which were brought back to the writer after the contents had been delivered orally. Peter Venerable cited in one letter the self-signed parchment that I have sent. The collection of letters of James of Vitry appear to have been based on original letters, not on copies, but how he obtained them is uncertain. When an author did not keep copies of his letters or recover them from recipients, the collection might be made by a secretary, assistant, friend or student, sometimes after the writer's death. Paulinus of Nola said that he had forgotten his letters to such a degree that I would not recognize them as mine unless I believed your letter. Herbert of Lozinger in the early 12th century, when he was about 60 years old, wrote to a friend that by the assiduity of your letters, beloved brother Norman, you try to correct my negligence, by which I have not kept copies of those letters which I have frequently sent to my friends, and have not collected into a small body, a corpusculo he calls it, in the form of a register. Peter the Venerable's secretary, Peter of Poitiers, also took a hand in writing and collecting his letters. Exceptionally active letter writers, like Bernard of Clairvaux and Catherine of Siena, had several secretaries who drafted their letters and presumably kept copies. Other collections were made entirely by an assistant. The secretary of Abbot Gervais of Prémontré wrote that I have put together some letters composed, dictatus by him, and written by me, and some others, which were before my time, and which I lately found, thrown aside. After saying that he had also included 2 treatises on letter writing, he went on to say, you must know, however, that I have thought fit to slip into this little book some letters sent to my abbot, not so much because their style is elegant, as because their senders were important. The resulting collection thus included letters both by and to Gervais, was intended to serve, together with the treatises on dictamen, as a model for letter writing. Many collections exist in several versions, compiled at different times, both during and after the author's lifetime, and with substantially different contents and versions of the letters. The letters written by Anselm when he was prior and abbot of Bec, for instance, exist in 2 groups of manuscripts, which one contains the letters, the collection as it was about 1090, and the other after it was corrected and reworked by Anselm, who improved the text in small details, omitted some passages and letters, added other letters, and rearranged them in approximately chronological order. The various collections of the letters of Yves of Chartres appear to have been made after his death by scribes who selected letters according to their own particular interests. There are 4 different versions of the collection of Arnold of Lisieux, and at least as many, if not more, of the letters of Peter of Blois. Letters and letter collections were regarded as works of art, and few writers could resist the temptation to revise and improve them when the opportunity presented itself. They did not share the modern scholar's respect for the form of a text as it was originally written, or for exactly when it was written. These revisions were often quite small, but others were more significant, and were made not only by the author himself, but also by others both during and after the author's lifetime. We have seen how Arnulf of Lisieux recovered copies of his letters in mendicatus. Peter of Blois sent out his letters for corrections, and Vibald of Corvey is known to have revised the letters of other writers. The letters of Bernard of Clairvaux were revised by himself and by others after his death. The original version of his well-known letter to Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, was significantly expanded in about 1180 or 90. Later writers who revised and in some respects falsified their letters include Petrarch and Voltaire, who rewrote his letters dealing with the Prussian court in order to revenge himself on Frederick the Great. The character of a collection thus depends to a great extent on how the letters were preserved and arranged, and on whether the collection was prepared by the author or, at the time or later, by an assistant. It poses relatively few problems if the letters were copied into a register or letter book when they were written or received. But collections based on miscellaneous copies and recovered letters are harder to interpret. The surviving evidence suggests that copies were often kept on loose sheets of parchment known as scheduli, which were sometimes folded into quires onto which relevant letters were copied. This may account for the presence in otherwise miscellaneous collections of small groups of letters arranged either chronologically or according to subject matter. Scholars are disagreed, however, over whether these copies derived from drafts, from the final versions of letters, or from originals, and practice may have varied from author to author. The letters of Rotherius of Verona, according to Weigel, go back both to drafts and copies. When both drafts and originals survive, they sometimes differ significantly. Collections based on the letter book of a single writer, secretary or scribe, even writing under several names, have a chronological order and unity of style that has been compared by some scholars to an autobiography, a Lebensbild. Collections derived from disparate leaves and recovered letters are different. In some, the letters seem to be in chronological order, often imposed after their composition, but not enough to allow their position in the collection to be used as a basis for dating. In other collections, including the Great St. Victor collection and the collections of Hildegard of Bingen and Adam Marsh, the letters are arranged according to the social and political position of the addressee. The secretary of Gervais de Prémontré said that he had included some letters because their senders were important. Yet other collections, as we've seen, were based on subject matter and bring together, regardless of the writer, letters dealing with issues such as the investiture contest and the Becket controversy. Miscellaneous collections, derived from various sources and subsequently revised and rearranged, are the despair of scholars who hope to use them for historical sources. They frequently appear to be haphazard, and perhaps sometimes really are. Christopher Cheney wrote of the collections of Anselm, Gilbert Folliot, and Grosseteste that each of them contains some routine administrative correspondence along with letters of a wider significance, a more philosophic flavor. All three include correspondence earlier than the writer's pontificates. All are selected on principles which defy explanation. Subsequent research, however, and a clearer understanding of the nature of letter collecting may reveal a structure that was previously obscure. The letters to Grosseteste, for instance, were long thought to have no chronological or topical arrangement, as Cheney said, are now believed to have been gathered by Grosseteste himself in order to show the importance of pastoral care in the life of the Church and of the abstract principles like love and truth in governing human nature. The collection of Bishop Lambert of Alsace, which consists largely of letters addressed to him and shows no apparent order, present a picture of Lambert as a perfect bishop. Even the collections of Peter of Blois, of which the differing arrangement or lack of it has long puzzled scholars, were probably put together to illustrate Peter's views on the proper conduct of life and the role of the clergy. Modern editors should bear this in mind when they are tempted to rearrange and reorder the letters as they are found in the manuscripts. Variety itself was an important principle in the Middle Ages and was an admired aspect of many letter collections. The author of the St. Albans letters wrote that the words of utility and pleasure in these letters constitute a harmony of writings in which both the indolent can be studious and the bored can be refreshed. For variety is the refreshment of man. Constant care and concentration on a single thing provokes boredom. Peter of Celle wrote to John of Salisbury that he had taken up the vessel of your letters, as he put it, and drained it to the bottom in an abundance of sweetness. If I seek the profit of opinions, or sound teaching, or pleasure of composition of words, or the truth and sweetness of love, I find all these things abundantly in your letters. Variety was probably one of the reasons for the popularity of the letter collections of Peter of Blois, which he repeatedly revised and changed. In the very first letter addressed to King Henry I of England, Peter wrote that the king had asked him to gather the letters which I have sent here and there and to various persons, and to bring them together like a various species into one bunch. This desire for variety and to make letter collections into works of art, accounts for the inclusion in many collections not only of several types of letters, including love letters, which begin to appear in the second half of the 11th century, but also of works such as poems, sermons, short and sometimes not so short, treatises, epitaphs, canonical sentences, charters, and other sorts of opuscula, whether or not they are in epistolary form. These are sometimes omitted in modern editions, but form an intrinsic part of the collections. Guy of Bazoches inserted numerous poems into his letter collection. Frumont said in the introductory verses to the Tegensee collection that he had included verses and charters, and Peter of Blois wrote at the beginning of Peter the Venerable's collection that in accordance with his instructions, I have now at last corrected and edited those verses which I composed long ago and have transcribed and arranged them at the beginning of your letters. Letters in verse are among the many types of letters listed in the index to Rockinger's collection of treatises on letter writing, and some collections are composed entirely of poetic epistles. These are usually assumed to be fictitious, but the poetic love letters of Marbot of Rennes may have been a real correspondence with the nuns of Le Ronceret at Angers. Other types of specialized letter collections consist of sermons in epistolary form and chronicles made up of letters, such as the Lahr collection. It is clear that many writers regarded their collections as a distinctive literary genre and adapted them as they saw fit. Most letter collections include only a fraction of the total number of letters written by an author. While some letters were included owing to their literary style and to add variety, others were excluded, but in view of the rarity of the survival of letters outside collection, it is hard to judge why some letters were included and others left out. Even the Register of Pope Gregory the Great, which is the largest and most systematic collection of letters to survive from the early Middle Ages, is incomplete and omits Gregory's single most important letter, the Libellus Responsionem, addressed to St. Augustine of Canterbury, which survives only to what appears to be a chance copy made in North Italy or South France, while the letter was on its way from Rome to Canterbury. Scholars must always remember these omissions and never assume a letter collection is complete in the form it survives. Even less is known about the circulation of collections than about their formation, but they were not private in the modern sense of the term. According to the translators of the letters of Hildebald of Bingen, perhaps the most important factor to bear in mind with respect to medieval letter collections is indeed the general publicness of the form. We've already seen that Arnulf of Lisieux sent a collection of his letters to Giles of La Perche, and that Peter of Celles read the collected letters of John of Salisbury. The secretary of Germaise of Prémontré, in the letter cited above, asked his correspondent to treat carefully this collection, which several people have already seen, who, having read in part, wish to read through and perhaps transcribe it, keep it properly, and return it soon. Nicholas of Monttier-Mamie asked his friend Dean Peter of Troyes to send him the letters of Hildebert of Le Mans, because we wished to copy them. Peter of Blois, as a boy, had to memorize and recite Hildebert's letters, and he later himself sent copies of his own letter collection as a gift or with a request that it be returned, either after being copied or quickly before copying. This and the number of surviving manuscripts shows that Peter's letters circulated widely. More work needs to be done on the manuscripts not only of individual collections, but also of more than one collection together with other works. Many editors fail to indicate the other works with which collections of letters were copied, the company they keep, as it were. Among the most puzzling of these composite manuscripts is Paris Bibliothèque Nationale, Latin 11,867, which was copied probably in England about 1300 and includes some 40 sections and over 1,700 letters. 232 of these constitute the so-called Campagna, or Capua collection, which is divided for no obvious reason into 4 blocks separated by small groups of disparate letters. Most of the letters in this collection date from the early 13th century and relate to southern Italy, but they differ greatly in character. Some deal with great historical events and others with a range of mundane topics. The manuscripts include several treatises on the art of letter writing, and many of the letters lack salutations, as in collections of exemplary letters, but it's hard to see how they could have been used as models or for any instructional purpose. Collections of model letters or formularies present special problems for historians, since it's often impossible to determine their date and character and whether or not they are real or fictional. Model letters, according to Rolf Kern, tend to be marked, among other things, by the abbreviation and standardization of the formal elements, by the substitution of initials for names, and by their concern with a single topic, such as love or friendship. The same is true, however, of letters in collections that were not intended as formularies and were simply stylistic exercises. Geoffrey Barraclough, in his book on public notaries and the papal curia, wrote that for the researcher among manuscripts, no discovery is less difficult than that of a new formulary. Every manuscript example library has its examples. On the one hand, this is still Barraclough, is the Summa Dictaminis containing stylistic examples, with or without theoretical discourse, for the writing of private letters in approved fashion. On the other, collections of legal documents for the instruction of the notary. Sheila Heathcote, in her study of the collections of the late 12th century papal notary Transmundus of Clairvaux, likewise said, since these letter collections are found in conjunction with a treatise on dictamen, they can immediately be identified as formularies, that is, collections of letters specifically designed to illustrate the precepts of good style laid down in the treatise to which they are appended, and to serve as models for the writing of new letters. Not all collections of exemplary letters are accompanied by dictaminal treatises, however, and the presence of a dictaminal treatise does not necessarily mark a formulary, as in the Campania collection. The letters of Gervase of Prémontré were accompanied by two treatises on letter writing, but they cannot be described as a formulary. It is indeed often impossible to distinguish exemplary from literary letters and stylistic exercises. Just as literary collections often include fictional and even forged letters, many formularies were made up of real letters, only slightly modified, and differed from other letter collections principally in arrangement and purpose. The letters of Alcuin were used as examples during his lifetime, and some were included in the so-called Formulae Salzburgensis. Einhard's letters were kept as models of administrative correspondence. Almost all the great formularies of the later Middle Ages include real as well as fictional letters, and many of them, like literary collections, seem to have been originally put together from loose sheets or quires containing drafts, original letters, and copies. The Admont collection, for instance, which dates from the second half of the 12th century, was made in many stages by at least 15 scribes and remained at first an unbound fascicle of loose sheets of parchment. It has been called a copy of the codified fair copy of a letter collection, but whether it was intended as a formulary is uncertain. The second Hildesheim collection, which was copied with two treatises on dictamen and clearly had an exemplary purpose, is apparently made up of real letters, as are the two Linköping formularies, which include a modified version of the will of the father of St. Bridget of Sweden, of which the original is known. The modifications include the types of changes, such as the elimination of proper names, designed to make it suitable for general use, but in most respects, it is an authentic document. The same is true of modern formularies and letter books, which are still widely used, especially by businessmen, for letters of congratulation and condolence, and also for love letters, which often claim, truly or not, to be based on letters that were actually sent. The Tegensee collection is made up of scattered groups of letters on specific themes, including poems and love letters, which may or may not be real. The Liber Epistolaris of Richard of Bury which was compiled in 1324-5, is a collection of both official and literary letters, only one of which was written by Richard himself, and includes at least one probable forgery. It has been called a combination of a formulary and a letter book, and an epistolary commonplace book. Other collections, like the so-called Trier-Stilübungen, were almost certainly made up of school exercises, as were, in my opinion, the recently published love letters attributed to Abelard and Eloise. There is, in fact, no satisfactory way of classifying formularies or determining whether the letters they contain are real or fictional. According to Heathcote, the difficulty of distinguishing the one class of letters from the other is one of the principal obstacles to the use of formularies as historical sources, and indeed to the study of medieval letter collections as a whole. She is referring in particular to the letter collections of Transmundus of Clairvaux, of which only one can be described as a formulary, in the sense that the letters were edited to make them general in character and selected with a view to stylistic elegance and utility as models. The collection includes letters of Arnulf of Ligia, Stephen of Tournai, Peter of Blois, and other 12th century letter writers whose works were presumably available in the library at Clairvaux, in addition to probably fictional letters designed to illustrate particular points of style and content. Among these was a letter from a monk, perhaps Transmundus himself, addressed to some friends, saying that they had asked him many times to gather into a single body, a corpus, my poor papers coming out of my poor satchel and sent to various people on various matters, and, he continued, only presented as evidence of my own little talent, which neither purple passages enrich, nor the motley verbosity of rhetorical colour adorns with flowers of composition. This may be mock modesty, but it suggests that they were his own literary compositions. Among the greatest formulas of the late Middle Ages were those of the papal vice-chancellors Berard of Naples, Thomas of Capua, Richard of Pofi, Marinus of Eboli, and Peter of Vinea, and among masters at Bologna, Boncompagno, and Guido Faber. They all seem to have been based on drafts written on loose leaves, which were later arranged and organized into books on the basis of date and subject. The overlaps between their collections have been attributed by some scholars to the notes taken down by students at their lectures. The fact that several of these collections are still unedited, and their daunting size, that of Marinus, includes 3,543 letters, various versions and organizations, and repetitions and overlaps, and the number of manuscripts, over 150 of Peter of Vinea, present serious problems and have tended to put off scholars, but they offer many opportunities for future research. In conclusion, therefore, I want to leave you with three ideas concerning medieval letter collections. The first is to break down the distinction between apparently different types of collections. Most literary letters, including those apparently of pure friendship, had a practical side, and business documents often had a personal side, reflecting the relations between family members and neighbors, between friends and enemies. The scholar must be on the lookout for the motives of the writers and collectors of letters and the light they throw on personal relations. Individual collections can doubtless be regarded as predominantly literary, instructional, or public, but their contents do not all necessarily fit into these categories, and many of them defy classification or any description. The second and related point is to avoid categorizing a letter on the basis of the collection in which it is found. The inclusion of a letter in a collection is no guarantee of either authenticity or authorship. Every letter must be assessed in its own terms. Even exemplary letters are often of value to historians, since they were designed to deal with real situations. The letters accompanying the dictaminal treatise of Bernard of Meung, whether or not they are real, illustrate the life of a bishop, and the letters in the Campagna collection illustrate many aspects of daily life. Nonetheless, and this is my third and final point, each collection and its contents should be considered both as a whole and for its constituent parts, which represent part of a network, large or small, connecting the writer with his or her correspondence. Recent studies on medieval friendship have shown the importance of letters in linking people together. Each collection represents a particular network, and more work needs to be done on the overlaps between these networks, which formed an important part of the social and political structure of Europe in the Middle Ages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Constable. Yeah, with this applause, I would like to open the floor for questions, and I'll be running around with the mic.
Giles, I'm curious why your reasons for doubting, I can guess some of them, but
Yes.
your reasons for doubting the Abelard and Heloise letters.
Now, mind you, I'm referring to the recently edited ones.
Yes. No, not the originals.
Well, I just don't think, I mean, I've written on this, and I think they show no evidence that they could have been written by two people living in the same house in the first half of the 12th century with her uncle, whereas they show every sign to me of being stylistic exercises of a 14th or 15th century writer. I really find it hard to believe that such a large collection, I don't know how familiar it is to you, could have been written in such a way that it would give no hint that it was actually written in the 12th century, whereas I think there are many signs that they are stylistic exercises. Do you have reasons? Do you believe in them?
No.
I see somebody nodding there who...
I just have it on my shelf, and I've
Yeah?
looked at it, and it seems rather generic, but...
Yes, well, there you go. You've answered your own question, Ken, yes.
Thank you for that wonderful talk.
Thank you.
As you were talking about the example of the man who confessed his own modesty,
Yes, yes.
real or not, and then this notion of friendship also leads me to this question. Do you find evidence in the letters of introspection, of an attempt to explain oneself or to become self-aware with a listening correspondent, so to speak, who would bring out attitudes and doubts, perhaps fears or whatever, in a subjective way?
Yes, I think so.
Is that okay?
This is a dangerous ground to step on because one can easily read into letters what in a way one hopes to find there and thinks letters should contain. But I think many 12th century letters, and later too, do contain some evidence of introspection. This is why they can so well be considered, and have been, as sort of an autobiography, telling something really about the author and themselves and their feelings, their attitudes, their fears, as well as their joys. But it's, if I may say so, a dangerous business. I mean, they were greatly influenced by other letter collections, and they admire these sort of qualities. And to what extent one can really justifiably say that this is the author himself or herself reflecting. But many of them do. I mean, the letters of Eloise, what I consider the original collection, of which I believe in the authenticity, certainly do tell you a very great deal about the inner life of Eloise. And I think some of these other great letter writers really do too. And so long as one approaches it cautiously, I think one can go there in the hope and expectation of finding something about the inner life of the writer.
Thank you.
The Special Collections Research Center has recently purchased a letter that we are confident is a letterbook copy. And the motivation for the copy was that it was a certain thing that the original would be destroyed. Do you have other instances of that?
No, I don't, and I'd be interested to hear more about it. How were they certain that the original would be destroyed?
It concerns John Brown and Harper's Ferry.
Yes.
And we know the historical circumstances pretty well, and we were really confident that the original letter was going to be destroyed by Mrs. Garrett Smith.
Ah.
And so the letter book copy was to guarantee the
Yep.
survival of the important first letter.
I think I would say in the Middle Ages there are examples where you could be sure that the copy was made in order to guarantee the preservation of the letter. But whether with any expectation that the original was going to be destroyed, that I can think of no example of. It may exist, but I don't know it. I think it was simply just done in order to help circulate the correspondence and give it more prominence. But it'd be an interesting question to keep in mind when studying medieval letter collections, or even copies of individual letters, but so rare they are.
I wonder if you can say something more about using letter collections to sort of see networks of various sorts in the Middle Ages. And I'm
Yes.
assuming that you mean not just who's writing to whom or who's claiming to write to whom, but also the ways in which the manuscripts preserve letters or seem to have, the way that letters seem to have traveled beyond simply a pair of correspondence. But
Well,
that's a
this is
question.
something that I would urge if there are any graduate students here looking for a good thesis topic. You'd make a very good one. Not yet a great deal of work has been done on this, but I think on various levels it can be done. I mean, of course, firstly, the collection itself, the individual letter, and the recirculation, which you mentioned. But it would require you'd really have to take each collection, you'd have to look at the manuscripts. It'd be quite a good deal of work, but rather fascinating, and to see where these overlapped and where they didn't. And to tie it in with other things, I mean, I think the circulation of mortuary rolls is something that might have some pattern. I don't know if any of you know what mortuary rolls are there, but when a prominent abbot or a prominent person died, they would send round a roll from monastery to monastery, and they would make an entry on it, some of them running into hundreds and hundreds of entries. What monasteries they chose, why the rotulari who carried these rolls, which were quite big, went to this monastery rather than that, we really don't know. And it'd only be if we could put together that sort of evidence, and maybe put it together with letter collection evidence, maybe put together, and it's something I'd love to have studied more, but I don't think I will myself, the witnesses of charters. Where there were, I mean, what institutions did they come from? We know that they were quite often from very different monasteries around there. Why did they choose X, Y, or Z? Was he already there? And therefore they just said, will you witness this? Or did they try to get such a person? Well, maybe such a person would be somebody to whom a letter had been addressed, or who appeared, was a member of a monastery in a mortuary roll. I think we begin to get a very much better picture of those networks. But so far, very little work has really been done on it.
Well, it would be amazing, but it does sound like a lot of work.
But good
sounds
work,
wonderful.
worth it.
Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful paper. Just
Thank you.
as a follow-up to the mortuary role
Yes.
comment that you made, it's interesting to see those sources as well act as sort of epistolary exercises and exercises in good poetry,
Oh,
because
yes.
a lot of these monastics do their very best to outdo one another and, you know, sort of talk about the person who's just died, but are really interested in really showing their stuff.
Showing themselves off, yes,
Exactly
because they
right.
know other people are going to read it, and
That's
they want to say,
exactly right.
those nuns at Le Bonsoir write well.
So that has
So
that
there's
in
some
common.
very surprising things in those roles, very surprising.
I remember the one example that comes to mind is Matilda, the abbess of La Trinité in Caen,
Yes.
who dies. And there's another nun at a monastery, probably 30 or 40 miles away, who says something very snarky.
Yes, didn't like her.
Didn't like her at all, and said, put this little poem down about, you know, nuns, abbesses who don't understand that nuns could fall in love, you know, should be in, you know, eternal torment or something really awful. So it's just fun
Occasionally we
to.
get the feeling they're saying good riddance.
That's right.
But that's a somewhat different aspect, but one of those mortuary rolls, which have now all been very well edited, would make a wonderful study.
Okay.
I was reading Paulinus of Nola and some of that
Yes.
group of intellectuals in
Yep.
the 4th century. Do you find letters that promote saints that are
Yes.
kind of propagandistic? Could you mention some others?
Yes, that's if you all heard that, it's a very important point. And these letters are really propagandistic and promoting the saint and the monastery to whom the saint is dedicated often.
I'm kind of fascinated by this notion of a letter collection as autobiography.
Yes.
Because, of course, we don't have a lot of real autobiographies, and if they claim
Very
to be
few.
autobiographies, they're usually something else. So this idea of presenting oneself twice, once in the letter and once in the arrangements of one's sort of letter over.
Yes.
This is. Can we use that as a sort of is there a development towards this kind of self-description or autobiography in a different literary form that we can put into something like a history of the self, or
Yes.
is this something that's all around throughout the entire Middle Ages?
No, I think it's rather rare, but it is there and something to be considered, above all when it's a single. You know you have a collection by a single author, that it presents it. But I'm interested too, the much more obscure now and only beginning to be studied, is a cartulary as a self-presentation. It's pretty clear to me the great cartularies of Cluny, which I've worked with a bit and some of you probably have also, really couldn't have been used for practical purposes. And if you wanted to find a charter which gave such and such an estate to Cluny, you'd have to look for months before you could find it, because they're not classified that way. What they are is they're classified under the abbacy. And they show what Abbot Odilo or Abbot Maiolus did for Cluny. Now, mind you, this is purely in a property sense on the whole. I mean, there's very little about the personality of the abbot in there. But this likewise could be interpreted as a form of auto-presentation of the role of this or that abbot in doing this or that. Of course, what often happens in editing cartularies is the editor comes along and redoes them all into chronological order. And then this aspect of the cartulary is entirely lost. But it's with the letters too, that's why it's so important to bear them. And if there are poems and sermons and treatises in there, even more, there is a self-presentation of the author really as a writer, as a creative writer, marked by the variety and types of things that he or she can write. It's not much work's been done on it, but it's a very good thing.
All of this conversation kind of reminds me, my interest is in kind of the continuity of the principles of classical rhetoric through,
Yes.
Late antiquity, Middle Ages, and the Ars Dictaminis is a big part of that kind of transmission of rhetoric. But this conversation is reminding me of in the Roman Republic, the orators would write their orations down, generally afterwards. And depending on where you were and what the competition was, you're generally competing for students often.
Yes.
And they would write these as a kind of publicity to get their name out there.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if that concept, playing with that concept it would be very interesting to see with people outdoing themselves. I mean, the monasteries are kind of competing with each other for attracting perhaps intellect. And I'm just wondering if some of this is strangely about publicity, getting the name out, and an aspect of kind of a general overall communication strategy that could be seen kind of broiling around.
I suspect you're right, not only for institutions, but also for individuals. And Nicholas of Montierremy, Nicholas of Clairvaux, his reputation has been blown upon because Bernard accused him of forging his letters, which I don't think is altogether justified, but that's another question. He was clearly a very sought-after letter writer. He was known to write a good letter. Now also, what you suggest, with the comparison with or the citing of the Roman, many of these letters were delivered orally. The writer, or at least the deliverer, would actually read the letter. That's why the original may come back. How they delivered it. People must have known that X could deliver a very good letter. And obviously that didn't work out so well for Hadrian IV and Frederick Barbarossa they delivered his letter, and they misinterpreted it, or at least they maybe didn't realize the effect it would make. But the effect of a letter was frequently through an oral presentation, and I'm quite certain that the writers of letters must have been aware as to who, particularly if you wanted something, and most of these letters you did want something, who was able to do this. And it's on a very reduced scale from your Roman orators, who are obviously thinking of influencing the Senate and God knows what. But these people were indeed, and I think it probably would be known. It would enhance the reputation both of the institution and of the letter writer and of the presenter.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the letter collecting as a form of autobiography.
Yes.
And I wondered if, in the course of thinking about the different letter collections, the ones which seem to have been put together by the letter writer
Yes.
himself or herself, if there are any characteristics that are shared among those collections. I'm thinking about the debate about Anselm's letter collections and why were Anselm's letters collected? Sally Vaughan and Richard Southern had the debate, and Vaughan's case was that Anselm wanted to collect the letters because he wanted to preserve his own image for the future and preserve his own legacy.
Yes.
And that was one of the reasons why he told Edmer to stop writing his biography, because he wanted to make sure it was his story of himself that came out. I wondered if you had any general reaction to any of that.
Well, I really don't have very much more than you've just added to what I've said. The man whose name I mentioned, Bernhard Schmeidler, who now is not as highly regarded as he used to be, though he had his own troubles even during his lifetime. I mean, because Karl Adman, who was probably a greater scholar, opposed him on this. But Schmeidler was the man who had this really idea that most letter collections went back to a letter book. Most scholars wouldn't accept that now. But those that do present. And even letters collections that were recovered, and that's what Anselm's would, probably had a motive of self-presentation. But one would have to look at the various forms. Peter of Blois' collections would be a marvelous thing to do, but I mean, talking of a daunting job. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts, many, many versions. I mean, it's been sort of a scholarly great swamp, quicksands, I should probably say, into which eminent scholars are sunk trying to classify the letters of Peter of Blois. But yet, if you could get the successive versions of his collections and look at why he put some letters in, the others not, I'm sure you would find that there was a great deal of self-presentation there, and that the changes he made were related to that. With Anselm, I think we know it fairly well. And I would agree that, though he was not a man who one particularly wants to say should have been concerned with his self-presentation, I think he was. And this revision of his letter collection shows it. And we could approach other letter collections from this point of view, I think.
It does seem like Anselm comes off pretty well in his letters, or he comes off as a serious
and that may be no chance.
Yes. Whereas
yes.
Bernard of Clairvaux really shows a nasty side to his character, I think, when I read his letters. And Peter of Blois doesn't seem as in control of himself with what he says in the letters.
And yet that may have been part of his own plan. This would be the kind of thing one would have to study. We have very little evidence of the revision by Peter of his own letters with successive versions.
Just a small thought aside. It's interesting that seemingly the letter as a physical object
Yes.
Was considered not having any value, so that they copied the text, they wrote it into letter books or preserved it in one way or other, but they threw away the object.
Yes.
And that's kind of strange, because I mean today a letter is a thing. It's a piece of paper.
It's of considerable value. And one would have thought a letter of Bernard of Clairvaux, or somebody who was considered a saint almost during his lifetime, would be kept as a relic.
Yeah.
And that there would be, any Cistercian monastery would be proud to have an original letter. Nope. They simply don't survive. And this may be related to the desire of the writer to revise it, that he or she himself did not necessarily want that original version out there, wanted the opportunity to present themselves as they wanted with the wisdom of hindsight, as well as they wrote it at the moment. But I do think it's very surprising that there are so extraordinarily few, and mostly those purely chance survivals of no importance whatsoever. I mean, not sort of the great letters of great people.
We have occasion for one more question, and then we'll continue.
It's been mentioned a few times that letters could be used as tools of self-promotion, but I was wondering if we try to move away from that and just look at letters as something, we know whether or not letters have been used for self-promotion. Is there a danger of reading letters and reading something about the way the socioeconomic sort of status of the person instead of just reading something about self-promotion? I imagine that letters and writing was left to sort of the elite of that time. So how much can letters really tell us about late antiquity?
Well, by adding late antiquity, I know less about that. But there are letters that dip more deeply than one would think into society. This companion collection, as I say, includes some extraordinarily mundane sort of documents about repairing the roof of a farmhouse or something like that. But there are very few of those. I think the self-promotion, and nearly all of them, which I think maybe ought to be questioned, but every letter had a purpose. It was quite a big deal to write a letter. And to deliver it, it involved expense. You couldn't do it just for nothing. I mean, even today, letters involve, well, with email they become relatively more easy, but the old handwritten letter is probably almost going to be a thing of the past now. And those had a purpose if you wrote them, even keeping up connections. Historians used to say, these are sort of useless, just letters of friendship. That just should be cut out, because it may not be self-promotion in the real sense, and you're not trying to get something, but you want to preserve a connection with somebody. And that brings us back to the whole question of the network and keeping those friendships just bubbling along in case you may need somebody. And my bet is that a request very often went in the mouth of the carrier, which we know nothing about, and really that the letter, therefore, was a letter of introduction. But that would have to count again as self-promotion of one sort or another.
Professor Constable, thank you so much. Please join me in applause.
Thank all of you. And we thank Jim for bringing us together. Yes, I won't touch this.
While Albrecht is dewiring Professor Constable, I'll take the opportunity to announce the last speaker of this day. That is William Lemoy, the curator of the Special Collections Research Center here at Syracuse University Library, the Bird Library, part of which is the famous von Ranke collection, whose digital existence, a part of its physical existence and its catalog especially, Professor or Dr. William Lemoy is going to talk about right now. Please give the word to William Lemoy.
I'm here trying to catch you with the...
Yes, I understand. Can you hear me? I have to do one more technical thing in order to give you some images. mouse movement is a little awkward here. Very last item said Ronca Library. Did it? Okay. Good afternoon. I was asked to make a few remarks about the acquisition of the personal library of the legendary 19th century German philologist, historian, and historiographer, Leopold von Ranke. And I can assure you that I am painfully aware that I am the last obstacle between you, this distinguished gathering, and a reception. I therefore promise to keep my commentary to a reasonable length. We should begin our discussion with the portrait of Leopold von Ranke by H.G. Hermann in 1883, after that by J. Schrader. And there you see it. It graces our reading room on the 6th floor, place of honor. And you can see that von Ranke is in robes and with full medals apparent. And we have another image that is a little different image of von Ranke, but here he is situated in his library. I think he's trying to look out a window. That stream of light is from the window, I believe, but he is firmly ensconced in his library, and he is not going to relinquish this until the end. The first fundamental fact that we must contend with is that the purchase of the von Ranke Library was a genuine coup for the fledgling Syracuse University. It was rumored that a half-dozen universities were keen on acquiring the library as well. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Cornell were all believed to be in that company. Syracuse University, however, had several advantages, even as new as an academic institution as it was. The first one was Charles Wesley Bennett. And there he is. Bennett was on the original faculty of the university, having served as a professor of history and logic, and as chair of the history department. The last 10 years of Bennett's tenure at Syracuse University, and here is the significant pause, were spent as the university librarian. Bennett was very much acquainted with the needs and indeed the deficiencies of the young library. He was also very much experienced with Leopold von Ranke and his famous library. He had studied with von Ranke at the University of Berlin between 1864 and 1866. We now have evidence that Bennett conceived of the idea of acquiring the library of von Ranke during his very first year as university librarian, and resolved to monitor the health of his former teacher very closely. What is remarkable about Bennett is that he remained fixated on this project of purchasing the library for Syracuse University even after he had left Syracuse University to join another institution, the Garrett Biblical Institute in Evanston, Illinois. I mentioned that Syracuse University had an advantage in the person of Charles Wesley Bennett. It also had the distinct advantage of benefactors, doers of good, in the persons of Professor John Morrison Reed. I apologize for the image. It was very grainy. I had a negative that I might have been able to get a print from, but this was what I could do this week. And also the wife of Professor Morrison Reed, that was Caroline Reed. And there she is in a better image. The Reeds had, in fact, enabled Bennett early on in his position as university librarian to conduct a European buying trip to enhance the holdings of the library. It was on the completion of this European trip that Bennett first informed the Reeds of his grand scheme to acquire the von Ranke Library. What amazed Bennett was that the Reeds were not frightened by the amount of money that Bennett suggested might be needed for the purchase. The Reeds readily acknowledged that they could not supply that amount of money at that moment in time, but they encouraged Bennett to continue his attentiveness to the health of von Ranke. Here are the words used by Professor Reed as recorded by Bennett. "This is beyond my means, but keep your eye on this treasure, and it may be that by the time von Ranke is through with it, my ability to purchase may have increased." Reed obviously knew something about his prospects. When Leopold von Ranke dies in the spring of 1886, Charles Bennett had already been in his new position in Evanston, Illinois for approximately 2 years. Upon hearing of the death, however, Bennett immediately contacts the Reeds, and they commence the real campaign to acquire the library. Propitiously, Bennett had already been preparing to travel to Europe that spring, and he and the Reeds actually devise a system of codes by which they can communicate secretly or securely through cablegrams. In Bennett's own words, this is how he described the situation. "To tell the simple truth, no one plan of my life had so absorbed my thought, and in whose consummation I had such deep interest. I knew the contingencies, but I was resolved to do all in my power to secure a result which had been a darling purpose for 12 years. Bennett is so committed to the purchase of the von Ranke Library with the Reeds' assistance that he undertakes to engage in the negotiations personally. Otto von Ranke, the elder son of the family, is the one who was serving as executor for the estate. In these negotiations with the son, Bennett also has a clear advantage. He can demonstrate his first-hand knowledge of the collection and a full realization of Leopold von Ranke's place in historiography. During his lifetime, for example, von Ranke was the only honorary member of the American Historical Association. We have in our library also the medal he was given as a former member of the Institut Impérial de France. There it is. And flipping it over, Ranke, and you see that it is Associé étranger. Even the French were willing to acknowledge von Ranke's place. We also have, the Bennett was, after all, one of the next generation of historians sent forth into academia from Leopold von Ranke's famous seminar at the University of Berlin. As impressed as Otto von Ranke is with Bennett's knowledge of his father's work, he does not have for one instant a belief that Bennett and Syracuse University can successfully compete with the interests of the Prussian government in making certain that this library does not leave Prussia. How do we know this? We are informed of this in a letter written by Otto von Ranke, to which Bennett will eventually have access 1 year later. I felt sorry for the gentleman, that is Bennett, for he entertained hope of securing the library when he was doomed to certain disappointment. I wished to do all I could to save the gentleman's feelings, and hence readily promised him the first chance, that is, first refusal if the Prussian government cannot move forward. I had not the remotest thought of the possibility of his success. Bennett had this consultation with Otto von Ranke in July of 1886, and von Ranke maintained that a decision would be made in August. Otto von Ranke is so completely convinced that the library will be purchased by the Prussian government that he then had the collection moved to the Royal Library. What Otto von Ranke cannot control, however, are the more cataclysmic events in Europe that suggest that a general European war is imminent. And the Prussian government, under such conditions, cannot possibly focus on the disposition of a private library, no matter how important it is. Bear in mind that because of Bennett's skillful negotiations and Otto von Ranke's favorable reaction to Bennett, if the Prussian government cannot act, Syracuse University has the next option for the purchase of the library. The other reality was that no other German entity seemed to be in a position to purchase the library in its entirety. Family clearly did not want to have the collection leave Germany, but they were also determined not to have it broken up. 8 months after Bennett's first meeting with Otto von Ranke, Bennett, with the approbation of the Reeds, invoked a critical strategic move. He sent a message that the decision on the purchase of the library must be made in 2 weeks, or all offers from Syracuse University would be withdrawn. This daring maneuver was successful. And here is Bennett's final exultation on his achievement. How was my heart gladdened while I was visiting the Missouri Conference on receiving a cablegram forwarded from my home announcing the consummation of a long-cherished plan, the purchase of the von Ranke Library. And while I could not hope to reap the benefits which such a collection affords an institution to which I had given 14 of the best years of my life, would be greatly enriched, and my successor in the chair of history would greatly rejoice. Bennett, after all, had always remained devoted to Syracuse University. The benefaction of the Reeds needs to be mentioned further because they not only supplied a sum believed to be $25,000 for the original purchase of the library, they also gave a gift of $100,000 for an endowment, and in addition provided money believed to be $15,000 for the repairing, shipping, and cataloging of the library. I do not think that I need to point out that these sums in the 1880s amounted to what we would regard today as real money. Here are some images of the collection as it became housed at Syracuse University. Please note, that's the famous portrait of von Ranke hanging in that prominent location. You can see stack formations. Aside of the building, you see carrels, and again, there's the portrait at that point. There's one view of the library built to house the collection, and a different view. There is one sad note that must be mentioned at this juncture. Charles W. Bennett was supposed to deliver one of the main addresses at the official opening of the von Ranke Library, but he was not able to because he had contracted Bright's disease. Nonetheless, the most complete account of this story of the acquisition of the von Ranke Library is the one provided by Bennett himself. And it is this relation in the university archives that I have summarized for you today. Now, perhaps we should, at this juncture, look at a few highlights from the collection. Its scope consisted of some 17,000 volumes, 7,000 pamphlets, and 430 manuscripts. Because Leopold von Ranke was particularly interested in the origins of modern European history, he collected material from northern Italy as it was making its way out of the Middle Ages. Thus, we might begin with Libellus Fratis Telephori by Telesphorus, dated 1391. This manuscript concerns a prophecy about a period in which there are two popes, a good one and an evil one, and the conflict between them. Even though the prophecy described was an ancient one, the manuscript was being distributed at the precise time when there were, in fact, two competing popes in Europe. As a consequence, this was a truly dangerous document. What you see is the final leaf of the manuscript, and it has this image of the deposing of the evil pope. And Professor Pennington, who has already spoken to this group, is much better prepared to explain the significance of this manuscript from the von Ranke Library, and I encourage you to speak to him about it separately. This is another woodcut from Ab Urbe Condita, or a Roman history, and it's the first rare, very rare, German edition of Titus Livius's History of Rome, dating from 1505. I think we're supposed to take away from this that there are undisciplined soldiers in the Roman legion here. You see some drinking in the foreground, gambling behind those, and general loitering, I would say, is what's going on here. This is another image. Is that the one, David, yes, that you had in mind? Yes. This is actually from it's the title page of a German history of Pope Adrian VI by Pamphilus Gegenbach, published in Augsburg in 1522. This particular Dutch pope was the last non-Italian one until Pope John Paul II. And I think David wanted me to point out the
crow's feet.
The crow's.
This example of caricature is not only on the face.
Another dangerous piece is one by Nicholas Copernicus, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, Basel 1566. The diagram on page 9, or I should say actually leaf 9, the way that's structured, captures the significance of the volume with the sun in the center of the solar system for essentially the very first time. This book and the controversy surrounding it ultimately resulted in Copernicus being held under house arrest for the rest of his life. This is actually the second edition. We know von Ranke wrote about English history, and the number of volumes concerning this topic in his library is considerable. An example is Histoire navale d'Angleterre, since the conquest of the Normans in 1066 to the end of the year 1734, but the significance is, as the extending title makes clear, the volume is based on original manuscripts, public documents, treatises, and journals with a great number of facts and observations that had never been published. And of course, this is getting at the concept of primary source material that characterizes that library. We also have a history of Serbia and the Serbian Revolution, and again, from original manuscripts and documents. This is the point that is trying to capture about this particular source. And this is indeed a fascinating narrative about the von Ranke Library, but it does not end with the acquisition of the library. The university, for its part, constructed the library building to house the collection purchased by the Reeds, but it would not be until 1977 that James M. Powell, a professor of history in the Maxwell School, was instrumental in crafting a grant that would come from the National Endowment for the Humanities and supplemented by a number of local American and German charitable groups to catalog the entirety of the collection. It was Professor Powell who directed this cataloging project, and here is a photograph of Professor Powell in the von Ranke stacks, and we know those volumes. That is the von Ranke collection. And here we have two of the catalogers from that project. One of them is in this room.
The other being John Morrison, who went on, I believe, to the 18th century cataloging project.
I believe that we have another image to show you that is significant, and that is the book plate, specially created to recognize the contribution of the Reeds in the purchase of the von Ranke Library.
Before you leave that image, if I may interrupt for a moment, Professor John mentioned about how hard working that Professor Powell was, that Ranke's motto was there at the bottom of the shield, or body play there. Labor ipsa voluptas, work is its own pleasure, and I think Dr. Powell exemplified that very well.
Yes, indeed.
And I'm sorry if you were going to say that too. I wanted to get that in before we had a chance to go on.
This, of course, represents the last stages in the cataloging of a book, plating it. In November of 1979, Professor Powell and his team made this assessment about the von Ranke Library. No other historical collection in America enjoys this twofold claim to fame: a role in the founding of the historical discipline and a valuable resource for continuing research and the communication of its results to new generations of scholars and students. With the accomplishments of Professor Powell, the legacy of the Leopold von Ranke Library has been realized. Professor Charles W. Bennett and Professor and Mrs. James M. Reed made the original acquisition possible, and Professor James M. Powell and his project team made it certain that the content of this famous library would be truly accessible. These are signal accomplishments for the university that we should celebrate, and we are, in fact, headed towards a reception. I believe that a toast is in order. To Charles Wesley Bennett, to Professor and Mrs. John Morrison Reed, and to Professor James Matthew Powell. Together they brought the august library of Leopold von Ranke not only to Syracuse, but to its full potential. And I thank you for your kind attention.